No, you don't need the.
I'm doing this my way. He a legend, he a legend, he a legend. He a legend, he a legend, he a legend.
Talking on it though, then
He
you
a
can't bring it
legend.
up later.
Welcome to the league, to the league, to the league, to the league, to the league of items. Welcome to the league, to the league, to the league, to the league, to the league of items.
What's up, everybody? It's Pikel with League of Items, and in today's video, we are going to discuss perception versus reality, and how it will show itself in the T1 and DRX matchup. I think that most people will agree that T1 is an overwhelming favorite going into this match. They've had much higher expectations placed on themselves by the fans. And they're just the more prestigious organization, better pedigree, better kind of everything from the outside perspective. But I think a lot of that just comes down to perception versus the reality, that this match is much closer than what you may think at first. Before World started, a lot of people were talking about how the LPL is better than the LCK, and that, I think, demonstrates the perception versus reality narrative as well. The perception was LPL is better. The reality was the LCK, the upper echelon of the LCK is just as good, if not better, than the LPL. I think that the best teams from the LPL and the best teams from the LCK, there's not much that distinguish the two from each other, except for potentially style and fit in a given meta. So I think that the fact that the narrative was LPL is stronger was fundamentally wrong, and the fact that it was really even, if not LCK favored, should kind of help people take a step back and think maybe things aren't as they appear. So let's talk about the matchup more directly. I'm going to go through a couple of the things that I think what the perception is versus what the reality, in my opinion, is, and then I'll do a deeper dive on some of the games that led up to this. But I want to get the perception versus reality stuff out of the way first. So in order to make my argument, I am depending on a couple of assumptions. The first one being, since T1 has side selection, I assume that they will pick blue side first. I think that most teams would do that. I think in general, blue side is better to draft from. However, DRX has won 2 games on red side in each of the matches leading up to the finals, and I don't think that's a mistake. I think that helps DRX with how they approach draft. So if T1 is 2 levels deep and thinks to themselves that DRX would actually get an advantage by drafting on red side, then maybe T1 picks red, but it just seems unlikely to me. I think they'll probably just assume that by picking blue side, they'll put additional pressure on DRX to ban out a lot of champions, Caitlyn, Yuumi, maybe something like Aatrox if they're afraid that Zeus would blind pick it against Kingen. But a lot of champions like that, which could shift the first match. So let's go into perception number 1. The first perception, incorrect perception that I think a lot of people have is that T1 is more talented than DRX. So let's just go lane by lane. And maybe this is the one that most people kind of believe in, especially right now. The biggest narrative surrounding Worlds, in my opinion, in regards to specific players, has been that Zeus and 369 are the 2 best top laners in the world, and by a considerable margin. You hear all the casters talking about that, the analysts saying how much better they are than other people. I really don't see it. I think that, especially the way that drafts have gone, you see the strengths of a player like 369, the strengths of a player like Zeus, and then you see their downside as well. I do think that Zeus is better than 369, and I don't think that 369 is as bad as people were saying he was during the top esports fiasco. But I think it's kind of just overcorrected itself, and now people want to say that he's the best in the world, or one of the best in the world. I just really don't think so. I think that players like Breathe are just as good, if not better. than 369 specifically. It'll be interesting to see how much staying power Zeus has as a top laner. I think that he's very good, but I think that Kingen is also very good. Kingen is probably a little bit less of a household name, due in large part to the fact that they've changed teams a couple of times. They went from BLG. When they were on BLG, BLG wasn't as good as when Zika joined the team, in my opinion. And then they went to DRX after DRX lost most of their good players. DRX's roster went from being arguably the best in the world to being pretty bad, and a lot of people attributed that to Piosik underperforming, when in reality he didn't have good players around him. The fact that Zika wasn't there, that was probably the biggest thing, and then also Beryl. Zika and Beryl really changed things when they came over this year. So even if you want to say that Zeus is better than Kingen, I think that I can agree with that part of it. But since they're going to be picking blue side most likely, that will increase the percent chance that Zeus has to blind pick a top laner. And as long as he's not blind picking Yone or something like that, DRX should have the option of either hard countering whatever Zeus picks, or getting into a very familiar matchup that they know exactly what they want to do against Zeus. It's gonna reduce the volatility of the top lane, and in order for them to snowball Zeus and get Zeus very far ahead, they're gonna have to give him additional draft resources, or they'll have to play around him topside, which would force Owner probably onto a less carry-oriented jungler. Maybe he plays something like Poppy. He is a pretty good Poppy. But I think that the best teams and the best champions for teams to be picking right now is more like Viego, Graves. Those are really the two best in my opinion. That's just the way that I would approach drafting if I was one of these professional teams. The takeaway from this should be Kingen is good enough to win when he gets counter pick. And he's played against some good top laners getting to this point. I think that Zeus is better than Flandre, Zeus is better than Doran. But Kingen isn't a complete pushover. I think that he'll surprise a decent number of people in the finals. So that's that. Let's move into the jungle. And this is the one I think that most people probably have the most wrong. I would assume that the general consensus is that Owner is a better jungler than Piosik. And that's for people who have a short memory. 2 years ago, when Piosik was on DRX, when it was Piosik, Chovy, the team was much better. Piosik was arguably the best performing player on that team at Worlds in 2020. Obviously 2021 was very bad for them, but now we get back into a meta that allows Piosik to shine. If they're putting Piosik onto Sejuani or Poppy, I think that means DRX is in big trouble. I think they need to continuously look for ways to get Piosik onto carry champions, even if it's just the Graves Viego, which is pretty common at this point. But there's a reason why they're two of the strongest jungle champions in this meta. And then we also have things like Kindred, which will be something that restricts draft a little bit, or forces T1 to draft around, or ban it out in 4-5 for the second half of the draft. It puts additional draft pressure on T1, where they will already have some issues because of top lane. The influence of top lane, the influence of the jungle, I think both of those things will kind of force them to only ban junglers if DRX decides to push it to 4-5. And it kind of all plays into itself because we also have to talk about mid lane and bot lane still. But not every top laner is good enough to warrant bans. Not every jungler is good enough to warrant bans. You can a lot of the time see teams just focusing on whichever player has the most restricted champion pool. Like we've seen some mid laners get banned out, and then we've seen just overpowered champions get banned out so far. And that might happen in this as well. But hopefully we get to see some interesting champion choices from DRX and from Piosik. Then we should go into the mid lane. I think that especially before last weekend where Zika went off, I think that definitely going into Worlds, people would just say, Faker is better than Zika. I thought that Zika was better than Faker so far this year, and if you look at some of my videos from before Worlds, one of the things that I said, I think it was like the 19-30 minute mark of the teams that the best players and best teams at Worlds 2022. I think it was around the 20-minute mark where I said specifically, if DRX makes a run during the World Championship, we will leave the tournament thinking that either Piosik or Zika or both of them are elite players. And I think that we've kind of, reached that point. I think everyone will just assume that Zika will perform like this for the rest of his career. He's an extremely good player. Both Faker and Zika worked with Coma. I was kind of surprised at how little attention that storyline got. I know that right when he joined Vici Gaming, that was one of the first things that I realized and one of the first things that I talked about, and that's why I've believed in Zika for so long, is because you need to put your faith not only in the players but also the coaches that they're working with. And Coma is a great talent evaluator. Just think about all the mid laners that he's worked with, the other people who would sit behind Faker and then go play pretty well in the LPL. Scout, now Zika. What was the other guy's name? I forget the other guy's name, but there was another one. There's been at least 3 mid laners that have been pretty good after sitting behind Faker. And then we also have Closer, who's still in the LCK. So just a lot of good mid laners. I think that the perception is that Faker will have a deeper champion pool, which is probably true, but I don't think that a lot of the pocket pick champions that Faker will bring out are going to completely warp a draft, because Zika also plays these champions. We've seen Zika play Ryze, Galio, Akali, Sylas, and Azir. I think they've both played all of those champions at Worlds, and I think they've both played Ahri as well, either during the LCK playoffs or during Worlds. And I'm not saying that Zika is better at all of those champions than Faker, but he's definitely not worse. I don't want to count out Faker. Faker is one of my favorite players, if not my favorite player of all time. 2 of my favorite players are Faker and Keria. Keria is maybe my favorite player. Piosik is one of my favorite players. Zika is one of my favorite players, and Faker is one of my favorite players. Those 4 are definitely in my top 10 right now, which is part of the reason why I was sad when it was Piosik, Chovy, Deft, Keria. What an amazing roster that DRX had. So it's not totally surprising that a lot of those players have still found their way to be on very good teams. But yeah, Zika, the thing with the mid lane in this matchup is that both mid laners are so good at so many champions that I really don't know if it's worthwhile banning out a bunch of these champions. Maybe T1 says to themselves, we'll ban out Sylas, we'll pick Akali, or vice versa, and then force Zika to show us something else. But if they do that in Game 1 and DRX wins, because they're also putting a lot of pressure on the draft in the jungle, because Piosik plays some strange champions, there's also the pressure of top lane, because you don't want to give away Aatrox to anyone, especially somebody like Kingen. And then you still want to get a good bot lane matchup, so you don't really want to leave the Ashe Heimerdinger or Kate Lux or Lucian Nami, one of those pairings. Maybe there's one that T1 thinks is going to be the best for DRX and they want to play around it. But that's really the decision that T1 has to make, and it'll be interesting to see what decision they end up making in regards to draft. And that's really honestly my favorite part of League of Legends is the drafting and thinking through the different scenarios that might happen. So there's that. And then in the bot lane, we have Gumayusi and Keria against Deft and Beryl. And this is probably where T1 has the biggest advantage in my mind. Not in terms of player talent, but in terms of the draft. And it's a double-edged sword because T1 will most likely have the advantageous matchups in bot lane because DRX will probably be the one picking bot lane first. I assume that in this draft, we're going to see T1 pick a power pick, whether that's the Graves or the Viego, Aatrox if it's left up blind, Akali or Sylas in one if the other one is banned, or they start one of the combinations of a good bot lane duo. Like if Caitlyn is left up, maybe they pick Caitlyn or Lux. If the Lucian is left up, which it will not be, Lucian will not be left up in this match, I don't think, because Deft I think is historically bad against the champion. Not saying that he can't play it or that if the other team picks it he's doomed. It's just they've been banning it throughout Worlds for a bunch of the different AD carries they've played against, and they've played against some good AD carries. They've played against Viper and they played against Ruler, who in my opinion are the two best AD carries in the world. So this really shouldn't be a huge issue going up against Gumayusi and Keria. The thing is that Gumayusi and Keria aren't like Viper, Mako, and they're not like Ruler and Lehens. Both of those AD carries are more traditional hard carry ADCs that want to play Jinx Ophelio style, have their team play around them in late game team fights. Gumayusi Keria are much more volatile. They are more of a playmaking bot lane, and that is a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing for T1 if they're on their game, get a good matchup in bot lane, and then can play around it because they've drafted let's say they pick Poppy, and then a roaming mid laner. They have some kind of utility AD carry, and then they have Keria on one of his 1 million champions that he plays. They can put a lot of pressure on bot lane by rotating everybody down before a dragon, ganking bot lane, forcing summoners, retreating onto dragon. That could be a play that we see pretty often, especially in game 1 where T1 is on blue side, because it ticks a lot of the boxes. You leave Zeus top lane where it's a matchup that he probably blind picked, so maybe he's getting beat up on and is losing that matchup. Then you have the ability to get owner onto a champion that, like Poppy, that somewhat not counters, but it's like a soft counter to a lot of the champions that Pyosik would want to play, and it also gives owner the early game playmaking ability where they can gank pretty easily as somebody like Poppy. And then it also secures the engage, which is one thing that both of these teams kind of not mess up. It's, in my opinion, is a mistake when teams kind of don't pick enough engage during the draft, don't draft enough engage for their players. So yeah, that's when it's good. When it's bad is when T1 feels obligated to make plays. So in that same scenario, if they don't draft something like Poppy, or if they don't have mid lane priority, or if they mess up early game a little bit in bot lane and DRX is slightly stronger than what they would think, then they go to make that kind of play. That one play goes sideways, giving DRX additional resources. Then T1 feels obligated to make another play because T1 is the team that's more likely to index more heavily into the early game, just from player profile, the player profile perspective. I think that Faker, when he's on something like Galio, they love the early and mid game plays because they're basically asking a lot of questions of the other team. It's like, we're rotating everyone bot lane. Are you? Like, did you realize that? If you didn't, then we're going to dive you bot lane. You're going to die. We're going to pick up, 1 or 2 turret plates. We're going to pick up a dragon. And force the other team to react, which is really what's going on in a blue side draft. You want to be the team dictating the pace of play, use as much tempo as you can, and also utilize the things that you placed high priority on in the draft. Like when you're picking on blue side, you want to utilize that first pick in the draft to warp the entire game. So that's the aggression. That's the aggression angle of T1. The thing is though that DRX, Deft is one of the most experienced AD carries in the world. That is generally a good thing. And then you have Beryl, who's a former world champion. So I don't think we will get into a spot where DRX is completely outmatched. unless we see something like Beryl on Heimerdinger again, where they die early and then they continuously die, and then DRX doesn't have enough power in the early and mid game to kind of stave off the bleeding and scale into the late game, which they ended up kind of accomplishing in one of their games against EDG. It was game 2. Yeah, game 2 was the one that really, Beryl got kind of focused, and they should have won game 2 in my opinion. That was a very close game. They had a gold lead. I think that they should have converted that game. So they really should have won 4-1, which is what a lot of people were saying. That's when Deft had like the one auto attack flying through the air, and then the inhibitor respawned. But yeah, so that's kind of where we're at with the bot lane. So again, the first perception that we've talked about, and I've taken a decent amount of time to talk about it. Perception is T1 is more talented. I think that they're really not more talented on average if you averaged out like all the different players. I do think that Keria is better than Beryl, but Beryl's playstyle allows him to keep it pretty close. Gumayusi against Deft. I mean, Gumayusi has a lot of promise, but is he that much better than Deft right now? I don't think enough to kind of stomp bot lane. Zika is probably better than Faker at this point. Doesn't mean that Faker can't be a huge attribute to his team. He definitely is. Piosik is better than Owner. If we disagree about that, we disagree about this entire matchup. And then, Kingen is closer to Zeus than most people think. Those are kind of my opinions on the talent. And then this one will be quicker. So perception number 2 is that T1 is more experienced. And I think that the reason a mixture of like experience and also more of like a winning mentality recently, because they performed better throughout the year than DRX. I was looking at stats before. I'm pretty sure that T1's win percentage this season is like 75%. DRX's win percentage for all of 2022 is like 55%, which that will impact people's perception a lot because they're only winning about half of their matches. So how could they compete with somebody like T1 who's winning so many more of their matches? DRX had a pretty bad spring. They didn't really kind of mesh as well as people hoped they would initially. And before the season even started, before spring even started, I was saying DRX is my team from the LCK for 2022 to exceed expectations, and it's because of the talent stuff that I'm talking about. So a lot of people, didn't really have DRX on their radar because they didn't trust Piosik, they didn't trust Zika, they didn't trust Kingen, but I did, and I have the video proof, so you can go check out other videos earlier in my channel, earlier from this season. But again, Kingen has more experience than Zeus. I don't think it's really, enough to warrant like favoring Kingen in this matchup. Because Zeus's pedigree is, so high, that's probably a wash. So then it comes down to talent, probably benefits Zeus a little bit, but not as much as most people think. Piosik is much more experienced than Owner, just in general. He's been around for much longer. He's been on arguably a better team. I think that the DRX from 2020 was such a great team. They just didn't have good drafting. Yeah, it was pretty bad, which, happens a lot with Chovy teams where they kind of just mismanage how they're using resources in draft, but that's a different video for a different day. Faker is more experienced than Zika, obviously, but then Deft and Beryl are more experienced than Gumayusi and Keria, and it's by a huge margin. Beryl is almost always going to the World Finals, like with Damwon and now with DRX. It was one of the best pickups in the offseason. DRX getting Zika and Beryl in one offseason is amazing. They knew that they had a great jungler in Piosik. They knew that they had a great AD carry in Deft. Piosik was very shaky during the end of summer, and they felt obligated to go get Juhan. And Juhan helped get them to this point by navigating the regional finals. I think that they were down 2 games, and then Juhan came in, won the series, and now Piosik is flourishing, which is a great story. And hopefully, if DRX is able to win the championship, I hope that Juhan gets, a decent amount of credit for allowing them to get to this point, because he bought them that extra time to get into this meta, which fits them better. But yeah, I think overall, if you counted number of Worlds games, I'm like pretty sure that DRX just has more games. If Faker warps that, I guess I wouldn't be totally surprised, but DRX has a ton of experience from, two very, very good veteran players in Deft and Barrel. So this moment will not be too big for them. Number 3 is, I don't know if people have said it yet, like on stream and stuff like that, but I bet that this week or in the pregame show for the finals, I think that they will probably talk about the path that both teams had to get here. And I would think that most analysts would just say, oh, well, T1 had to play against RNG and JDG. That's much more difficult than playing against EDG and Gen G. But I think that the best team out of the opponents from the quarterfinals and semifinals, I think the best team is Gen G. Gen G had to play against Damwon Kia, and EDG isn't a pushover either. I think that EDG, if they matched up against RNG or JDG, they could beat either of those teams. JDG did look more powerful, but EDG is a really good team, former world champions from last year. The side of the bracket with Gen G, Damwon Kia, DRX, and EDG was undoubtedly the stronger side of the bracket. I think that Gen G against T1 is probably a favorable matchup for Gen G. Damwon against T1, if we had that matchup, it'd be questionable. It'd be a toss-up. The only reason why DRX against T1 isn't looked at as a toss-up is because DRX didn't have a lot of expectations coming into the tournament. But I would say that DRX has had the more difficult journey. They've played 9 very difficult matches, 9 difficult games. They had to play through play-ins. They had to go through all of these different things. They beat RNG in the play-in stage. Like, they've dealt with a lot of the same stuff that T1 has dealt with, but then they've also dealt with former world champions in EDG, and then the favorite coming into the tournament, which was Gen G. So I would say that DRX has had the more difficult battle to make it to this part of Worlds. And then last but not least, and this is the one that I guess I'll end it on, because we've been almost talking about this for 30 minutes now. I think that another narrative that I expect to be used this week is that all the pressure is on DRX, because DRX has made this huge journey, but now they're up against T1. Now they're up against Faker. Now they're up against Zeus, the best top laner in the world. Now they have to deal with Gumayusi and Keria. They barely made it to Worlds. They barely beat EDG. They had a good match against Gen G, but they had to go through so many more games. They had to go through the play-in stage. They had to deal with so much more. Do they have enough left in the tank to take over T1? Can they do it? But I really, after seeing Deft's reaction from beating EDG, I think that they're kind of they're over all that journey stuff. That's what he wanted to accomplish. He wanted to get past the quarterfinals. Now it's kind of like free money. I think that DRX has exceeded most people's expectations, and they know that if they lose to T1, everyone will still give them a ton of respect. Maybe the players themselves and the coaching staff would be disappointed because you're in the World Finals, you have the ability to take home the championship, you want to do that. But the pressure isn't external at this point. The pressure for them is internal. For T1, I think that most of the pressure is external. I think players like Faker probably puts a lot of pressure on himself to perform at a high level, and I'm sure that they all do. I'm sure that every player in this match will put a lot of pressure on themselves, but T1 will also be feeling the external pressure and the expectations from everybody watching, because now Zeus is the best top laner in the world, right? Now Owner has the ability to become one of the, best junglers in the world, which even if they win this, he's not one of the best junglers in the world. He's a good jungler, and he's able to be on a team that has the ability to win the world championship, but he will not be the player that kind of does it for them. Could he have a match where he has a ton of kills? Yes. But that's really not how we should be thinking about these players. Like, if you can take over one match, good for you. If you can take over almost every game that you're in, then those are the elite players, like players that warp drafts and warp matches, like Kanavi, like Kanavi. Let's just leave it at that. But those are more of a mark of a great player. And then you have players like Faker, the external pressure, like can he do it again? Is he too old? Does he still have hands? Like the crazy stuff that people say. And then Gumayusi and Keria, like can this very good bot lane become great? Can T1 establish themselves as a dynasty and be competitive for the next 2 or 3 years while they still have Faker, and they can like put additional resources into the top side of the map and the bot lane by giving up a little bit through Faker. And I'm not saying that Faker can't play things that carry, like we've seen him play Akali well during the tournament, but he isn't the focal point of the team anymore, which is not a dig at Faker. It's just kind of the reality. But yeah, I think that environment that we're going to be in is going to be a potentially dangerous thing when T1 is also probably going to pick blue side and also most likely pick more aggressive early game and mid game champions in game 1. If DRX can withstand the pressure in game 1 and wins game 1, now the pressure's on T1 again. Should we pick blue side? Should we switch over to red side? They had a good plan. Should we change up something in our draft preparation? And T1 probably wouldn't. So if DRX drafts intelligently in game 1, withstands the pressure, withstands the onslaught that T1 will kind of attempt to perform, DRX will be in a very good position. And I think that it's just maybe it's a fluke. Like maybe I've gotten into this position like on accident, or like maybe I shouldn't think this, but like I really do think DRX has a very good chance to win Worlds. And I thought they had a chance before the tournament started. I thought they had a chance back in like January, February, once their roster was solidified, because that's how good these players are. So I'm not surprised that they're in this position, one match away from becoming the world champions. But it is a little surreal. Like I bet on them at plus 2,500 and plus 4,000 to win Worlds. If they win Worlds, I'm gonna win 4 figures, which is gonna be cool. And like I'm trying to think like, do I hedge out of it a little bit? But I'm at the point where I love T1, I love DRX. I like almost all these players on these 2 teams. I would be very happy if either team won. Like, so I might just let it roll. I'm going to be at a wedding, so like I'll probably be wasted by the time that the match starts. So, I mean, I'm probably just going to let it ride. But yeah, that's basically it. I think I've laid out some pretty okay reasons why DRX, should be taken as a much more serious competitor going into the finals. T1 is still like a minus 400 favorite, which is insane. Before the tournament started, you could bet on T1 to win the finals at like plus 300, or you could bet on Gen G or JDG around plus 300. DRX is plus 300 right now. You can go bet DRX plus 275, plus 300, and all I have to do is win one match. So it just shows you how crazy kind of betting can be when you get in early on a good team. But again, that's all I have for you today. Thanks for watching. And I'll talk to you later. Go DRX.